This is the Fresh Start Project, where we explore the growing loss of trust in social institutions and how we can break free from broken systems towards something better. My name is Christian Misluik, and with me today is Matthew Lohmeier. Matt is a former lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Air Force and author of Irresistible Revolution, Marxism's Goal of Conquest, and the Unmaking of the American Military. In this book, Matt revealed how Marxist materials were being promoted at Buckley Air Force Base in Colorado, where he served as a Space Force commander. For discussing this book subsequently, he was fired from his command. Matt, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks, Christian. Happy to be here with you.
Yeah, so I first want to point out that you've recently started a podcast in which you explain in detail your story. So I'm going to put the link down in the description. So I encourage everybody to check out your podcast to get the full detailed explanation.
Great.
But perhaps right now we can briefly summarize some of the events that led to you writing the book and what happened afterwards. So first of all, what was your role at Buckley Air Force Base? And secondly, what did you see there that prompted you to write your book?
Great. Yeah. So my role at the base was a commander of a space-based missile warning unit. During the Cold War, we had established ground-based missile warning systems across northern latitudes. And shortly thereafter, to complement that ground-based missile warning system, we had established a space-based architecture that uses predominantly infrared capabilities to detect heat signatures on the Earth and to we're the first to see them, in fact, if there's a missile launch. And in fact, the American people will probably be fairly surprised to find out just how many missile launches there are each week in the world.
Oh, really?
That you never hear about, many of which occur in the Middle East. But I was in command of a space-based missile warning unit and had been in that role for a year at the time. It was about 1 year ago. 2 days from now, it'll be 1 year that I was fired from that command. And as you mentioned, the reason I was relieved of my command was because I had published a book about Marxist ideology as a underlying impulse for a lot of the current critical social justice activism that we were seeing. And had it not been in the military environment and just been a broader Western phenomenon or broader American and societal problem, I would have totally left it untouched. But the fact is, when you start to politicize the military working environment, which is what I was seeing at my base, and then subsequently, very shortly thereafter, learned was happening at many bases across the globe, I thought, need to try and use my chain of command to address this. I need to file a formal written complaint to document this in writing, which I've done and I've shared on my own podcast, as you mentioned. And then seeing that that wasn't going to be effective at combating some of this, and we can get into any level of detail you'd like, I determined I was really driven. And I don't emphasize this enough when I talk about this publicly. I probably didn't emphasize it enough on my own show. Sometimes in life, you feel an extraordinary burden to do something. Or usually, I'm not talking about times you feel like, oh, I shouldn't do that. You feel a burden to do something. And people say, oh, it was placed upon me, or I was called to it. Or I genuinely believe there are those moments that you can't let them pass by. And I felt an extraordinary burden on my shoulders to write a book about what was happening, because I sat in the seat as a commander and was active duty. And so I had a very unique internal perspective, internal to the U.S. military, that the outsider doesn't have.
Right.
And I was able to talk about things maybe an expert in Marxist history wouldn't be able to talk about from the outside. But I also had the understanding of Marxist revolutions and Marxist history because I'd studied it quite a bit, as well as a number of other things. And I thought, well, I'm uniquely situated to be someone that can hopefully make an advancement for the better and eliminate politics. I'll say that more accurately, eliminate political activism from within the ranks of the military. So that's where I was at. That's what led to the writing of a book. And that's ultimately why I was fired, although I believe to this day unjustly. And I'm guessing senior military leaders don't necessarily disagree with my assessment. I think they're probably wondering if that was the right thing or not.
Uh-huh. And what exactly were you seeing that indicated to you that this was Marxist propaganda?
Right. What I mean by Marxist propaganda, because there's a number of ways you could tackle that, and there are plenty of people online now that are doing an excellent job educating the American people about what that exactly means. But what I meant by it initially, and what tipped me off to the fact that this was in fact Marxist ideological subversive effort that was underway across broader American society and the military, was the stereotypical oppressor versus oppressed narrative. Okay. Yeah. And whereas in Marx and Engels' 1848 Communist Manifesto, that had largely to do with economic class stratifications, it has taken many faces and have gone by different names. And its most recent vitriolic iteration, unfortunately, that came out of academia and is now rampant in this country, and is called things like the diversity, equity, and inclusion industry, for example, is critical race theory. And if you just learn about critical race theory alone for a little while, it is abundantly apparent to you that it has a Marxist lineage of ideas and schools of thought within academia over the last 100 years, back to critical thought, critical theory, that is started by Marxists when they. This is an overgeneralization, but when they come here to flee the Third Reich, some people come here to flee the Third Reich. They're Marxists, and they end up at Columbia University, and they're at the Teachers College, and they're pushing the communist agenda in this country. It doesn't really take hold then, but that's the beginnings of what in the university setting led to what we're seeing today. And so, high level, that's what I mean by the Marxist narrative, is the oppressor versus oppressed narrative, specifically that the white man or woman is the oppressor of the black man or black woman.
Yeah.
I'll tell you, that's not even popular on either sides of the political aisle, mostly speaking, among blacks or whites or any race in the military, because they didn't sign up to start to be race indoctrinated and to hear that kind of talk. I mean, they sign up, wear the same uniform, take the same oath, do the same mission, and their thought is, hey, we're all equals here. I mean, that's honestly, that is the mentality of the preponderance of our service members. We're equals here. It doesn't matter our background. It doesn't matter how much money we came from. It doesn't matter if I had one mom and was raised by a single parent, or two parents in the home. All of that kind of fades away, and they shave everyone's hair off and put them through basic training, and then explain to them that you're now a part of a new unique fraternity or sorority of sorts that has a very particular mission to accomplish. And so you can't be encumbered by identity politics. And that has been on the rise dramatically in the past couple of years, but especially since George Floyd's death. And that came in the form of formal trainings and things at my base. I detail specifics of those trainings for maybe 40 or 50 pages in my book, without attributing those trainings to particular personalities. And let me give you one example. Just as now we get to the practical level, how is this manifesting at my base?
Sure.
And the experience at my base, while I wouldn't pretend to say it describes every base and everyone's experience, because I don't think it does. It was typical of many people's experience in uniform across all branches of the military. I had a young black male enlisted member of my unit, and he was participating in trainings that were being hosted by the chaplaincy on the base, who was working in connection with the base commander. And I only share the race just because it's incidental to the story, and because it actually matters in how this individual perceived what they were being taught. So there was a black service member learning from the black chaplain, who is working in league with the black base commander. And those two, the senior leaders, were pushing what I recognize as an anti-American Marxist narrative of history, and explaining that even our founding documents, because they were penned by racists, aren't necessarily worthy of continued support, defense, attention, but that's explicitly contradictory to the oath that our service members take to support and defend the Constitution against all of its enemies, foreign and domestic. I mean, that's still the oath.
Yeah.
And I had that young service member, after being trained about these things, about how evil our society is and how systemically racist our society is. And they were trained about how we might fix that problem. And of course, these were all Black. Now, others were welcome, but there were certain events that were for Blacks only. So in a careful, closed, segregated setting, they were trained certain things. And in other broader settings, you had a combination, everyone, boys and girls and Blacks and whites and Asians and everyone else. Again, things we didn't talk about a whole lot in the military because everyone was just one.
Yeah.
But I had people, including this young Black airman, sit down with me in my office and explain to me that they weren't sure how they felt about things that were being taught there, and they're not sure it's even healthy. Another Black female service member that was in my own unit came, sat down unsolicited by me, and she said, and this was as a direct result of these trainings done by the chaplaincy.
Yeah.
She said, I wasn't raised to believe this, but I've come to learn since being at this base and since going to these trainings with the chaplain that I'm an outsider in uniform and in my country. And that is just an unthinkable idea for most service members throughout most of American history, in fact.
Yeah.
And I know that's an overstatement, but frankly, the military has led the way of sorts among broader American society of inclusivity, like a genuine kind of inclusivity. And it didn't matter, in a sense, if a commander was white or Black and his subordinates were white or Black. It just didn't matter, because there's a chain of command, and that needs to be respected.
Sure.
So I'll tell you that's one of many examples that I've talked about and also traced through in my book. And when you see that kind of impact that it's having in the real lives of your service members, it really starts to trouble you as a commander, because you know that there's starting to be division.
Yeah.
Good order and discipline is starting to be disrupted. Trust between senior leaders and our younger service members starts to erode. And then it goes on, and then there's a new administration, and General Milley's up before the Senate Armed Services Committee and the House Armed Services Committee saying he wants to understand white rage.
Yep.
I mean, when you get into that kind of rhetorical spiral, if people aren't willing to take a stand and step aside and say, hey, I don't agree with that, and I don't appreciate it being in the workplace, and if there are military service members listening to this, I hope they listen very carefully. They have to be willing to say no when no needs to be said, and they have to be willing to say, that's not aligned with my values, and I just simply don't buy into your political garbage or your political narrative, because everyone is entitled to those views. That's fine. But don't show up and politicize the workforce or the workplace so that, or such that, Blacks and whites and men and women and people of different ranks are all looking at each other with a skeptical eye. Very unhealthy for a military to get into that position. And that's unfortunately what's happening a great deal even today across the globe in U.S. military bases. And it's dependent on base to base. Some bases are great and not having a problem with this from senior levels down, because they've got great senior leaders who frankly shield them from some of the race identity policies that are being driven from the Secretary of Defense and others.
Well, what confuses me is how these trainings are even introduced on base. Like, what does that have to do with military readiness, with lethality? Like, what even is the pretense?
It's okay. Great question. So each administration has to establish its priorities, and a Secretary of Defense, for example, has to
presidential administration.
Yeah, each presidential administration. So the Trump administration is determining its priorities and so on and so forth, and that's true for every administration. Well, each of those administrations also has a set of political appointees that then end up leading various organizations. One of those is the Secretary of Defense, of course. And so the Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, is a retired 4-star Army general with tremendous experience that he can bring to bear in his ability to lead troops, assess the national strategic threats that we face as a country. And within a month or two, probably within a month of his coming into his position as Secretary of Defense, he is informing all of the force in a written memorandum that the greatest national security threats that we face are global climate change, COVID-19, and white supremacy or right-wing extremism.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you, like, some people might believe that, but I guarantee you most people in the military don't believe that, regardless of their political bent. They just, even if they're concerned about global climate change, which is a whole different lane we could go down, but even if they're concerned about that, they're like, that's one of our greatest national security threats. And if it is, let's pretend that it is, then is it a thinking threat, a strategic threat that is on the move, dynamic? It's constantly trying to outmaneuver you as a United States military. And how is it that you combat that kind of a threat?
Yeah.
And do you, so the reason I bring the policy up and the strategic intent and our assessment of our national security threats is this. That has a trickle down effect then to the policies that are quickly thereafter established. What is it that you're going to have your service members spending their time thinking about, right? If the threats are those things, then you don't dare not talk about them anymore. You have to address them and teach your force about them. And so within short order, I mean, we're talking days, weeks of the Secretary of Defense letting us know that's what our greatest threats are. Another memorandum comes. There were a lot of memoranda that were flowing out from his office to our service members. Geez, I just had like a rabbit hole open up in my mind, and I don't want to go down it, but I'm remembering all of these documents coming in and people
Maybe
showing
later.
up. I mean, I had service members showing up in my office who had never addressed me this way. And they'd say, "Sir, what the hell is this?" That's like, I'd never heard that before.
Yeah.
That's like, but when your young service members are willing to be so bold as to show up in their commander's office and say, "This is garbage that's coming out of our senior military leaders," and then your obligation, regardless of how you feel about it, is to say, "Well, sit down, let's chat about it for a little bit and try and get some perspective instead of bashing your senior leaders." But what happens is a memorandum then comes out and the Secretary of Defense says, "Hey, all of you, since one of our greatest threats is white supremacy and right-wing extremism, and by the way, if we don't get on top of this quick, all these terrorists are going to destroy the country," then, and oh, by the way, it's not just a problem in the country, it is a problem within the ranks. That was the talking point. And everyone scratched their head, looked around and thought, geez, we've never heard of this before and don't know anyone who fits the bill.
Right.
And certainly if someone does fit the bill, they don't dare speak up and identify themselves as fitting the bill, because you'll be ostracized immediately for being a right-wing extremist Nazi who hates certain groups of people. Like, you don't belong in the military if you
Of course.
publicly identify as one of those. Well, and this is a long-winded way of saying the trickle-down effect is that then a policy memorandum or a directive comes out and it says, you guys, by a certain date, let's say it was in April or March, you will, as a unit, as a commander, you will have all of your forces stand down and take a knee from their typical operational training mission. You'll set that aside and you'll spend a day discussing this threat, namely right-wing extremism, with your troops.
Yeah.
And so for weeks, you've got the troops anticipating. This is key too. This is something you've not heard much about before. And I've not said much about this before, but some people who lived it, know what I'm talking about. For weeks, our service members are all anticipating a right-wing extremism and white supremacy down day, training day, where their commanders are going to bring them through talking points and training about that problem that exists. And there were certain required talking points that you had to hit upon, and they were relatively benign. But the overarching intent of the training was such that if you're an activist, you will use that platform and abuse and weaponize that platform to indoctrinate your people. Or if you're like me and I wasn't a left-wing activist, then I tried to frankly shield them from an overarching impulse of race identity politics and explain to them their oath to the Constitution and so on and so forth. But for weeks, we had service members, including commanders, getting online and Google searching things like KKK, white supremacy, and we were trying to actually understand a problem we've never frankly spent much time thinking about. And then the DoD informs us that they've been pulling data from our internet searches to determine what kind of attention right-wing extremism and right-wing extremist websites are getting from their service members, because they want to compile a report to release publicly to demonstrate that, in fact, we do have this unhealthy obsession with right-wing extremist platforms. And look at the Google searches of our own service members. Look what they're spending their time reading about in their free time. And that was just all bogus, because before all that happened, no one was looking up that stuff online. They were playing World of Warcraft or whatever the video game is in their free time. They weren't focused on this stuff.
Right.
And so very unhealthy climate that it created. And I've said this many times, it's worth repeating. If you could typify that climate, it is a climate of fear, where people run around skeptical of one another. They're afraid to say something that they fear might not now be aligned with a party line or talking point, because they'd hate to be identified as something. And this is true regardless of their political views. So people tend to keep their mouths shut as they get steamrolled by a political agenda, because they're afraid of being identified as something that is, quote unquote, a part of the problem, or a racist or an extremist, or something that might require you to get additional training on the side. So that's in a nutshell, that's racing through a whole host of things that require teasing out. I'm sure I could be attacked for some of what I said, because maybe it doesn't typify everyone's experience, and that's just fine. If it doesn't, I'm happy to hear that. But that's the honest perspective from my view of some of what's going on.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned people in your command before this began to be unrolled or rolled out. It was a mix of people with left and right-leaning political views, and they were all baffled by what was coming from.
Well, to push this kind of an agenda is a lose-lose for the DoD, because again, even if your political worldview, let's say, gives you this belief that those priorities are in fact correct, because there surely is a political divide on this. I mean, there's no mistake. And our American service member is, largely speaking, a mirror image of the American people. They're just a reflection. So if there's a split in the country, politically speaking, and there's a 50-50 divide, I'm not saying that's exactly what it is.
Sure.
Then you can expect that political demographic to manifest in the population of our armed forces.
It's like a representative sample of the whole.
It really is. And that's true racially, roughly speaking. It's true politically. It's probably true religiously, because you're pulling from every segment of American society. And there are quotas that are met in various regards. And so, largely speaking, the political dynamic or the social cultural dynamic of the military is a reflection of broader American society. But we are trained to be apolitical. We're trained to be apolitical, that you leave the partisan policy disputes outside of the doors of your workplace in the military, because that's for the disgruntled American population to worry about. That's not your prerogative. But I've already lost the bubble on what you had asked, and you asked me to talk specifically about. I might have made you lose it as well, so I apologize if I did. So, what's the problem with being a rambler?
No, that's all right. I think what I was trying to suss out was the before and after effects of these trainings. Yeah. Okay. So it's what I'm curious about is, let's say it was what the population of your base was like before these directives, these trainings came down. It was like a sampling of the American public's opinions politically, but then afterwards it seemed effective. It seemed like a lot of people got on board with the critical race theory.
Well, so every base's culture is, roughly speaking, just a functioning, probably roughly speaking, well-oiled military machine that has a mission to accomplish, and that might have to do with the flying world. If it's an Air Force base, it might have to do with space-related assets, missile warning or GPS or whatever the missions are. And a base's culture is somehow shaped by the mission that they're doing. And so the political tension that you see in broader society, it really doesn't, historically or traditionally, at least in my, I went to the Air Force Academy 22 years ago. And since from then until now, except for these last couple of years, I never really witnessed what I see currently happening. And honestly, like whatever was going on in the American domestic political arena didn't fundamentally change the culture of the military. Um, and so how things were at my base before this rolls out is, well, I mean, COVID changed a lot for everyone, but, and I showed up to command at my base right after COVID became widespread, and it was, roughly speaking, unknown. There were a lot of unknowns about COVID. And so that was a part of the climate of fear that's generated and seized upon.
Yeah.
But the bottom line is the climate or the culture of the base wasn't typified by partisan policy. It wasn't typified by race identity politics. Frankly, most people probably hadn't heard of the New York Times 1619 Project, for example. But then you start seeing official videos that are being sent out to the base all of a sudden, telling people they need to get educated and watch those videos. And then it's like, well, it's mandatory viewing now before our down day to discuss race in America. What you saw Black Lives Matter doing in the country broadly after George Floyd's death, a microcosm of that existed within the US military without the smashing of windows and stomping of police cars. But there was instantly generated a sense that, like, you can publicly support that group or organization, but you don't dare criticize what's happening because you're a racist. Or it's political partisanship. And a service member thinks, well, how come you can support it and it's not political partisanship, but you can't criticize it and it's political partisanship? And so really quickly, I don't feel like I'm scratching the itch of the question that you're after, but really quickly what you see is people then shut down and they're not willing to speak up. They're not willing to say anything because they're afraid of the new climate that's emerging. And in that new climate, very small segment of the population capitalizes on the opportunity to use their platform to bully people into a new worldview or a paradigm. And that happened aggressively at my base, constantly at my base. And so I was, again, uniquely situated to identify this problem that more or less showed up everywhere else. And let me share this too. This all really got underway aggressively in the Trump administration. And he was learning about this from both, I think, military senior leaders. I'm guessing leadership in my own branch of the military was chatting. We were a newly created service. Some of the complaints I had shared and maybe others had shared was working its way up. But Christopher Rufo, who's worked on exposing critical race theory in the schools, and others like him, they were funneling information to the Trump cabinet and eventually to President Trump directly. And he issued an executive order. So it was bad enough before the Biden administration comes into office that in September of 2020, President Trump issued an executive order banning the use of critical race theory vocabulary and diversity and inclusion trainings in our military, in our uniformed services, and in our federal agencies. And there was a big sigh of relief that was breathed in the federal agencies when that happened, because people were tired of being bullied by political activists. And unfortunately, at my base, that activism continued, although it was less public. It was pushed down to the lower levels for low-level activists to continue to pushing the agenda by establishing reading clubs and things, and read books that were still, in my view, they're anti-American. They're written by people that hate this country. But those were a part of official reading groups that were formed and sanctioned by the base commander, for example. And so we couldn't even stop with a presidential executive order some of this activism from occurring in the military, although I'm sure some bases completely desisted, completely stopped. Well, day one of the Biden administration, and it's somewhat refreshing to be able to, like, mention these people by name. It's not being in uniform, because I never could when I was in, I was very careful. But day one of the Biden administration, one of his first executive orders, and it was day one, an executive order was issued that did away with the September 2020 executive order from President Trump banning critical race theory. And military, uniformed services, and in our federal agencies, and instead mandated trainings that were steeped in Marxist critical race theory. And it kind of rebooted or reinvigorated the diversity, inclusion, and equity industry within the federal agencies. And then again, circling back to what you mentioned earlier, then policy began to trickle down very quickly that enforced those executive orders, that determined what trainings we'd be having to talk about these issues that we face. And in my view, even though global climate change and COVID-19 and the race, white supremacy threat, so-called, were all national security threats or priorities, the only one that we were really harping on the most was the race issue.
Mm-hmm.
And how does that make your service members feel? To be like, you got black service members, for example, that don't want to hear that they're a part of an oppressed class in the U.S. military because either they don't believe it or it disincentivizes their service. You've got Asians. I had one Asian sit down in my office. He said, "Hey, clearly, the DoD only cares about the black-white divide. So I don't know where there's really a part for me in all of this, but all I'm hearing about is the black-white divide."
Right.
And how, white guy bad, black guy virtuous and good, therefore. And like, even to these young people, 19 years old, 20 years old, they're like hearing this stuff and it just doesn't compute.
Yeah.
And so he told me he was getting out,
Yeah. So that young lady that you mentioned who was black, she said she never felt like an outsider.
Yeah, an outsider.
Like an outsider until she learned about the critical race theory. So
that's right.
When she mentioned that, like, was she distressed by what was happening? Was she coming around to the critical race theory point of view?
Well, here's my sense. And we had a couple of conversations that were quite lengthy.
Yeah.
I had kindly conversations with her, one of my troops. I had more direct conversations with the chaplain that was teaching her this stuff, and told him it wasn't welcome and he wasn't welcome to be teaching it to my people in my unit, because it was my sense is that something inside of her didn't really want to believe what she was being trained to believe, but there was a sense of, again, race identity politics. There was a sense of, like, if you're going to be true to your identity, then you have to acknowledge the true paradigm that you are an oppressed member of this society. And that doesn't stop when you put on the uniform. You're an oppressed member of the Air Force community. And so I think she's troubled. That's my sense. And she's troubled at the fact that, and that's why she prefaced it by saying, I wasn't raised to believe this.
Yeah.
Like, something inside of her wanted to hold on to, frankly, a far more lovely view of this country and of the human social experience. And but she was being compelled or coerced in a way to believe that things aren't as nice as you thought they were, and you've got a lot of enemies around you, and we have to learn to take care of them somehow.
Yeah.
And while that, ideas have consequences, and bad ideas have terrible consequences, and so you get that idea planted in your mind, even if you're not 100% certain it's true, the direction of your focus thereafter, what the things you're listening to, paying attention to, the way in which you funnel information and filter it, is somehow, I'm looking for the right adjective, molested. It's like, it's blurred. It's usurped by an ideology, and you lose some ability to focus on reality, and everything starts to be filtered through the ideological lens, and it creates a low resolution picture of humanity for you and causes you to be extremely judgmental of other human beings, and insists that the problem lies without and not within. Whatever the problem is you're experiencing, it's because someone else is maybe out to get you. Very unhealthy for the human psyche. Frankly, I think it's potentially, I'm not saying this about this young girl, but in the grand scheme of things, I think ideology like that seems to have some appeal to someone who struggles with some kind of psychosis or like some psychotic tendency that really appeals to them. I don't know if it's the saddest in them, and if that's somehow tied to being psychotic, but like, and I'm not saying that lightly. I think there's something genuinely ill about that worldview utterly collapses under the weight of your own depravity. The idea of woe is me and it's everyone else's fault. And we've got to set about now to fix everything in the world, and it's everyone else. And Jordan Peterson talks a great deal about that, and it's brilliant. I mean, he's brilliant on that topic, and it is the staple of totalitarianism.
Yeah.
It comes, and let me say this too. Sorry, I really am going on about this, and I want to say a couple of years ago, I heard Jordan Peterson say something about the incompatibility of the Judeo-Christian worldview with the Marxist ideological worldview. And I don't remember exactly what he said about it. I'm sure he's talked about it plenty of times. I don't listen to him all the time now, although I'm familiar with what he's done.
Yeah.
The Judeo-Christian worldview insists that there's something internal to the human that needs to be reconciled and worked on and sanctified and improved upon. And then your entire devotion should turn outward to the blessing of humanity, all with the aim of maybe meriting something in an afterlife. And the exact converse of that is that I could be better and I could be living in peace if it wasn't for all of these rotten humans all around me.
Right.
And there's a real fundamental problem that exists with all of them in society. And so I'm going to set about to fix all of them and judge them. Totally contradictory to the Judeo-Christian worldview. I'll say the Christian worldview. And it's so that you can establish a heaven on earth, a utopia of sorts, a state in which people are essentially their free will and their agencies taken away from them, and they're compelled to a certain view or a certain type of behavior that's nice.
Right.
Well, wouldn't it be nice if the state could make everyone be nice? No, it wouldn't be. That's a terrible thing. It's a terrible thing.
Yeah.
People should be free to choose to be stupid and mean.
Yeah. The freedom to be wrong, to the freedom to
right.
disagree. Yeah, I think I've heard Jordan Peterson talk about that too. It externalizes the conflict that needs to be done within, to you apply discipline to yourself, to judge yourself harshly and put yourself in order before you start trying to change the world around you. It's an easy way out. I think a lot of the Marxist potency is it has a kernel of truth. It is appealing to like the injustice that is inherent in life, but it gives people a path of very minimal resistance to feel good about addressing it.
Well, that's true. And the unfortunate side effect of that is that, while it might provide some, I mean, there's some.
Sorry, folks, we had a little tech issue, but Matt, I'm so sorry. You were saying?
It's all right. Yeah. So all I wanted to conclude that line of thought with is, while it might provide some temporary salve or something to, I won't call it the conscience, it might feel like it's temporarily solving some problem, some in your worldview and some hollow in your soul, but it only leaves you more vacant accepting these ideologies. I mean, we're talking about, people accept this because it's kind of an easy way to view things. That's other people's problem. But when you're not actively working on trying to understand your own soul and the proper relation that you occupy to the human race, you're only left with a vacuum of, I think it's a dark, hollow vacuum in the human soul and the human condition that you're left to confront. And even if you pretend to be about solving the world's problems, you have to go home every day and confront yourself. And that's an uncomfortable thing for someone that's not actively trying to be honest with themselves about the problems that they need to overcome in order to bless society and not to tear it down or to revolutionize it or to fundamentally transform it.
Now, because we have the benefit of people like Jordan Peterson or other scholars of Marxism who could come in and tell us exactly what is happening, I certainly wasn't quite aware of what was happening until I heard those points of view. It's clear to perhaps you and me that what the Marxist game is, it's been in play for over 100 years. It's to tear down America as it currently is configured and usher in a Marxist government. And so things like critical race theory, it's not really about addressing racial grievances. It's exploiting perhaps genuine issues, but exploiting people who want to have some meaning in their lives and externalize whatever darkness is within them,
Right.
using them as pawns to bring down the system. And so my question for you is, like, did you get a sense from interacting with people like this pastor who was spreading this Marxist propaganda? Was he, was he naive enough to just buy in and take this on face value, or was he Marxist at heart?
Well, I don't know that that was an either or. He might be Marxist at heart. He's also a very friendly, likable guy who smiles a little bit too much for my comfort level. And it's like, why are you smiling so much? But he's very friendly, very I hate to put it this way, Jesus-y. I mean, he's a Christian chaplain.
Like a Messiah complex?
Well, it's, you know, he was a Jesus-y Christian, and friendly. And so we had a lengthy conversation about why I thought the view of America that he was trying to share from what he felt was the goodness of his heart was actually rooted in a dangerous political ideology. I explained briefly why I thought that, and he simply just disagreed and said, that's just not true. That's just not true. He also explained to me that his mother raised him to know better, and that his mother raised him to know that all whites are racist. And I thought, well, that's hard to help someone like that. If you're not willing to grow up and see that that's not exactly true, then it's hard. You're talking past one another at a certain point. But having said that, I shared at the beginning of every chapter in my book, I shared an italicized vignette from my own life and my own experience. Most of those were from my military experience in the first person, about things that I thought would kind of tee up and frame the chapter nicely. One of those vignettes is about my encounter with this chaplain. And I thought, boy, it makes me uncomfortable to write about him because he's such a friendly guy. And like the tough part of me had to dig in a little bit and say, it doesn't matter that he's a nice guy. At some point, it just doesn't matter that people are nice if they're doing things that will erode the integrity of the civil society. It just does. And frankly, you look at the kind of an effect or impact that Black Lives Matter movement has had on the Black community alone in this country over the past 2 years. Look at some statistics, and I just read a report about this today about how violent crime has increased in Black communities over the past year and a half, about the violent crime rates, about police brutality, and everything has shot through the roof. Assaults on police and violent crimes committed against police in Black communities. I mean, the crime and the violence in the Black community specifically, as a direct result of some of the behavior of like a Marxist rooted Black Lives Matter movement, it has directly had a negative impact on the Black community, unfortunately. And so while groups like that purport to have a certain aim in mind, in fact, because the ideology that drives and motivates their spiritual impulses, it is such that they can't help but have the opposite effect of what they say they're going to do. They're wrecking people and they're wrecking things and buildings. And so they fundamentally reshaped a culture in which, for example, police forces might feel timid or afraid to get involved in an active kind of way in some of these Black communities where they were boldly in defense of the Black community before, but now they're afraid to do anything or they'll lose their job or their life, kind of a thing. I mean, I'm not overstating it. This is a really big problem in some of the inner cities in this country. And it's not exclusively the result of Black Lives Matter, but I like to point that out when I can, because they were kind of propped up on a pedestal for a while, and I think nothing good of them. I don't think anything good of an organization like that. And I'm willing to give people the benefit of the doubt, but I think they've got a rotten core, and that core is a stated aim of Marxist revolution. They're an enemy of the country. And I was willing to say that in uniform. That's why I wrote my book.
Right.
But that's not my words. It's their words. And that's the nice thing. I'm able to point at their interviews from 2015 in the San Francisco something Chronicle, how they say, hey, we're trained Marxists,
Yeah.
and point to their tweets where they're saying, this is the revolution. It's time to rise up, violently take this country back. And they were really hoping for something to happen that didn't, fortunately didn't fully transpire. But I have a prediction for you on this show. And one thing, if you take a look at 20th century Marxist revolutions, there are certain crossroads or junctures at which their revolutionary efforts might be better funded or they might have better resolve. Certainly the weather plays a part of that. So things are warming up around the country. It's a lot more comfortable for these folks that like to cause trouble to get out and do stuff. But also we're in a midterm election year, and I can't help but think that in the next half a year, you're going to see the resurgence of some of what you saw in 2020.
Yeah.
That's my view. I wrote that in my book as well. I really believe that. If it does, hopefully it doesn't break out into something far more broad, because it has that potential. And I warn about that in the last chapter of my book. And then my prediction is, if it doesn't create a civil war, I know that sounds alarming, but if it doesn't create civil conflict that spreads beyond whatever local manifestation of that violent impulse that exists, then it'll probably die off for a season in the winter months after the election passes. I mean, that's just kind of how these things work. And but they require substantial funding, and there are certain people and organizations that are happy to fund movements like the Black Lives Matter movement, but they're not alone. They don't act alone, and we're only scratching the surface.
Yeah. In terms of the Marxist agenda being pushed through the military, where does this go? Where does the military go from here? What are your predictions?
Well, you have to have elected officials at the federal level, specifically, who sit on certain committees like your House Armed Services Committee and your Senate Armed Services Committee, who are ferocious in holding our senior military leaders accountable for the politicization of our military, our armed forces. You'll if you don't, you'll continue to disincentivize individuals from continuing their service in the military, and you'll disincentivize people from being recruited to join the military. And that's true on both sides of the political aisle, and we're already seeing some of that this year.
Yeah.
And so we've got that problem that exists right now in the military, but unfortunately, senior military leaders acting on policy established by the Biden administration aren't letting up in their aggressive stance on some of these things. And so by and by, we continue to fundamentally transform, to use that phrase, fundamentally transform the culture of the U.S. military. Let me share one thing with you that's an insight. I've got friends in the flying community. I mean, I know I've got friends that are in command of fighter squadrons. Some of them, good number of them, are turning down senior leadership ranks and school assignments that come coincident with your promotion to those higher ranks. They're turning that down so that they can get out and retire, because they don't like where they see things headed.
Yeah.
The bad part about that is that they're really good people who the military and the American taxpayer have invested a lot of money in, a lot of time generating the kind of talent and expertise that they have. And that's lost when you purge those kind of people, or they choose of their own volition to leave.
Right.
So our military, like the American people, will continue to divide in a way that we've never seen, because political division wasn't an aspect of military culture. To the point where either there's some infighting and some unfortunate consequences and division within the culture, or there is a unifying of that culture that becomes a one-party system, like I've seen. And I mean, I visited the Chinese People's Liberation Army Air Force Academy back in 2005 and got to see just how a one-party military system works. It's Marxist. And if you ask them their view, their worldview, their religious belief, or anything related to that, they'll tell you they're Marxist. And they weren't raised that way, but they are now, because they're part of the military. And while that might seem like a long shot to the American who listens to this, don't be so surprised. Stop being surprised by what's happening in this country, because it happens so quickly as to leave you on the backside of a power curve understanding the world as it evolves all around you very rapidly. And there are things that are happening right now and last year and the year before that in this country that people wouldn't have predicted 5 years ago. And so if you think that it's not possible that you have a one-party military, essentially, even if people in that military feel differently inside, that's a different question. But there's a political agenda afoot that is a one-party system. That can happen very quickly in this country. Election outcomes determine that. But so do revolutionary causes within the country. And we've got just as terrible a domestic threat in this country as we ever faced from any external enemy.
Yeah.
And some of the external enemies, like the Chinese Communist Party, help fuel our domestic political disputes in this country through bots on social media and so on and so forth. I mean, they really do a good job. They're focused.
Yeah. Okay, so you mentioned strong congressional oversight, insisting that the military be apolitical.
Right.
You also mentioned at the very beginning of our talk that if a service member feels that they are being forced to do something or agree to something that they don't believe in, they need to say no.
Right.
Now, in the military, I'm a civilian, but from what I understand is if your commanding officer tells you to do something, you don't say no, you say, if he tells you to jump, you say how high. So how can a service member refuse an order or directive that makes them feel like they'd be violating their conscience?
Yeah, this is good. I hope that service members listen up to this because this will resonate with them. Your question will resonate. What I say will resonate. Most of what is happening by way of ideological subversion does not come in the way of direct orders from your supervisors, your chain of command. It comes in the form of discussions and a kindly smile on the face and a formal or informal setting where you simply have a conversation and listen to people's experiences. And our service members can push back respectfully by standing their own ground and standing for what they believe in. Like, for example, I believe in my country and I think it's a decent place to live. I think it's a great experiment in human governance. And I think our founding was noble. And they can even say that without getting emotional. And to think that such a view would be considered derogatory or off-putting in our military of all things. I mean, you think about that for a minute. You should be able, and everyone in the military should believe that or get out and don't serve. But you should be able to say that without any fear of retribution. And you could say also something like, and by the way, my values, which happen to be America's values or Judeo-Christian values, or even if you're an atheist, I got an atheist friend, by the way, he's a great guy who refused the COVID shot and he's very conservative and he's patriotic. And so he doesn't reckon, his worldview doesn't come from the same place maybe as his Christian neighbor, but he's fiercely standing for his belief, and his belief is that he's got personal autonomy, he's got sovereignty over his own body.
Yes.
And he has this natural right, whether it's from the gods or not, to some degree of sovereignty over his own flesh, for example, in regards to this COVID shot. Well, you have to go to great lengths to be in legal trouble in the military for saying no. Like, you have to be directed or ordered to get a shot and then say, I choose to disobey this order, kind of a thing. That will get you in trouble. And people are making that choice too. That's fine. You should do so respectfully in most cases. But there's nothing that says you've lost your voice. There's nothing that says you can't say, I'm happy to be a Christian. I love this country. And I don't think that it's a systemically racist place. And all of your bullshit, excuse my language, that I'm hearing in this training session, I just don't believe in. And so you'll have to, since you're all about inclusivity, you have to accept the fact that people have the same view I do. Yeah. With all due respect, sir, or ma'am, or whoever is speaking. And you know, you won't get in trouble for that. If you're mean-spirited about it, you're loud and angry about it, yeah, you'll probably make a name for yourself. But people need to learn that, and it's something that it's taken being out of uniform for me to fully appreciate. I was willing to speak up in uniform, but that's a hard thing to do. Yeah. And now I feel totally free that, like, I live in a country in which people can say what they want to. And I've lived my entire adult life in a military that doesn't necessarily train you to think that you can say whatever you want to, because you can't criticize the commander in chief. Yeah. Although people did a lot of that while I was in command, and they won't be held accountable because it was President Trump. People can't criticize, if you're in uniform, your chain of command. Don't criticize Lloyd Austin. Let me do that. You know, that's not your job. Your job is to do your mission, to love your country and to serve it faithfully, because that's what the American citizen expects of you, regardless of their political disputes. But just know that there are plenty of other people out there who are trying to hold those senior leaders accountable. You don't need to be the one, but you can speak your mind and stand for your values respectfully. And that's the message I'd like to, you know, give to our service members. I really believe in that.
Your friend who refused the COVID shot, was he in the service?
He was in the service with me. He's now a government employee. He's a government civilian, or government contractor, I should say. He too had to submit an exemption, but he couldn't file a religious exemption like the thousands of other service members who are filing religious exemption. And so he had to dig through the weeds on what type of exemption he might qualify for as an atheist. And he found one. It was ethical veganism.
Oh,
and
okay.
He submitted, we had a chat about this, and I'm not saying anything I wouldn't say to him, but I just thought, ethical veganism. And did it get approved? He said, oh yeah, it got approved. And I just thought, you've got thousands of people submitting religious exemptions and they're being disapproved or denied. And an atheist who submits an ethical veganism exemption request, who, by the way, also has been vaccinated with all the other vaccines, they're using that against the Christian and saying, you know, you're not opposed to vaccines. You've been vaccinated before all throughout your military career. And so you can't claim that you're religiously opposed. Well, this ethical vegan also has received vaccines, but they approved it for him. It's like, you're not the threat we're looking for. There's that kind of adjudication of requests for accommodation seems really unfair. And you have to ask, why is it that way? Why are they denying religious exemptions writ large, but approving some others, you know?
The vegans.
The vegans, right? We'll keep you around. You're vegan. Maybe you have low testosterone levels.
We'll keep you in the service though.
Right.
Well, I'm glad he found a way to game the system and refuse to compromise.
He's a patriot. He's a good guy.
Yeah, that's good. I think a lot of people who weren't creative enough to come up with a solution like that, they were facing disciplinary action.
They're being, you read articles every now and again, you know, Air Force separates 800 or Navy separates 1,000. I mean, these services now are starting to separate the service members who have refused the vaccine, and that'll continue over the months ahead.
It's not unreasonable for a soldier to be skeptical about a shot the government's going to give you. I mean, the anthrax vaccines back in the before the 90s, like the Agent Orange, the Tuskegee syphilis experiments. There's so many reasons to not trust the government, and so many people were compelled to do something that they did not want to do.
Yeah, and you have to, you know, I always go back to this. I've seen this I've said this for months. I've thought it for many months. At the time I separated, I haven't looked at the statistics for many months, and so I don't know what they currently are, but at the time I separated last fall, 0 people in the Air Force and Space Force who were on active duty had died of COVID. Okay. Now there are some exceptions, government civilians who maybe had comorbidities. You know, there were some deaths among that population, but our active duty service members who wore the uniform of their country, 0 deaths. And that was out of like 30 something thousand positive cases. So we were keeping really close track of the positive cases, 0 mortality. And we're going to force a vaccine on you for this thing that most of you have already caught now. And we're learning now that there's some side effects to the vaccine that were unintended or unforeseen, or maybe we're seeing, but were unreported. And there are pilots being grounded who have taken the vaccine because of heart palpitations and blackout issues and other things. And we're grounding them, while healthy pilots who have not been vaccinated, we're going to tell them they have to separate. Doesn't matter how many years in you have, doesn't matter how many hundreds of combat hours you've flown. And they're like 35 years old and healthy. And guess what? Like, they're not putting anyone at risk, and they're not at risk anymore. But the fact that the DoD is digging in their heels and saying, no, we're going to stand by our initial decision from a year ago that we're going to start getting rid of all of you if you refuse a vaccine, that just demonstrates that you're being driven by a political worldview that you will not let go of, or political motivation, or a genuine belief, which I find hard to believe, that your force is at terrible risk unless that next 2 and 3% get that vaccine.
Yeah.
I mean, we're at terrible risk if only 97% of us are vaccinated. And it's like, I don't fault anyone that got the vaccine. That's their choice. But it's a stupid decision from a military strategy perspective, from a military readiness and lethality perspective. If you're in charge of all of that and you're looking at the global scene, you're seeing Russia and Ukraine at war, and you're seeing NATO, and you're moving troops over into Eastern Europe, and you're kind of contemplating the potential spillover of a war that the United States might be involved in. And you're like, well, you should have got the COVID vaccine. We're just going to have to suffer in our military readiness for a few years, maybe 3 to 5 years.
Right.
That's stupid. It's a really bad decision. And you have to ask, why would a group of people with the best interests of our military and our country make that decision? And there's only a few there's only a couple of good answers, and they're really unfortunate answers. And you say them and you get labeled a conspiracy theorist. That's just not true.
What do you think they are?
Well, I'll tell you one of the best, that they're politically motivated decisions. That's a benign explanation that shouldn't be conspiracy theory related at all. The other I also believe in, and it's that there are people who are intent upon seeing a weakening of the United States military.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that those people are the Secretary of Defense or the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, although I think they deserve our criticism for the past year for a number of things that they've done. They also have a tremendously difficult job, and I acknowledge that. But I'm not saying they want that outcome, but I'd ask the skeptic who wants to say you're a conspiracy theorist if you say this is a part of a grand conspiracy to weaken the United States military or the United States presence on the world stage. Ask them, do you believe that there are any enemies that exist in this world to the United States of America who would like to see it decline in power, economically, militarily, and so on and so forth? And if their answer is no, and no one's would be, that's like, you've got an entirely unsustainable worldview and belief system. I mean, you're the one that believes in the unthinkable.
Right.
But you take that a step further. It's like, if the United States has enemies like China or the Chinese Communist Party or Russia, or if you're talking state actors or people that simply hate this country, and there's plenty of Europeans that do, and there's plenty of Americans that do, who might even be okay with the idea of a revolution that might overthrow the current system, let's say. And that's the language that came out of Black Lives Matter founders for a couple of years. If they exist in the world and there are others who are willing to fund them in the world, then there are groups of people, large groups of people, in fact, sometimes, that want to see this country burned, or that want to see it fundamentally transformed, to use Barack Obama's language, or that want to see it have its position of power on the world stage diminished, so that the new world order that needs to emerge on the world stage won't be encumbered by a powerful United States government and dollar, for example. That's what the Great Reset's all about.
Yeah.
And that's not conspiracy theory either. I mean,
no,
only ignorant people will label others conspiracy theorists for pointing these things out. And it doesn't even take long at all. And I'm talking like a couple of days of actual research online, and you can develop a really solid opinion about some of this stuff that we're talking about.
A lot of it's publicly available.
Spoken by the mouths of those who are interested in that agenda.
Yeah.
I mean, we're talking Klaus Schwab and those that advise him, and big, powerful organizations that are worth billions and billions and billions of dollars, and individuals who are worth a lot of money.
Yeah.
Or who have held high station as heads of state and whatnot. And, there is an agenda that's afoot. And if you're willing to accept that there is an agenda, I don't care what your domestic political views are and policy views, accept that there's an agenda that's potentially afoot, and see if that model, and you don't have to buy into all the conspiracy theory veins that are out there, because there's plenty of them, and I don't buy into a lot of them. but you have to accept that there is an agenda afoot to fundamentally transform and weaken this country economically and militarily so that a certain agenda can unfold globally. If you accept that, then try and make sense of all the policy decisions that are rolling out. Then try and make sense of the talking points and where we're funneling our money. And it is a far better model or framework for interpreting the data that swirls all about you, all the conflict and dissension and arguments, than a model that says, no, people with great intentions who are noble in character and intent, who are trying to do the best thing for the security of the United States citizen, they're the ones making all of the policy decisions. Yeah. I mean, that's just, that worldview no longer stands. And there have been times in U.S. history in which that very well has been true or largely true, but there is a deep-rooted effort underway to thwart the successful progress of the United States. That's why we return to things like race identity politics. We're not advancing to a discussion of things that now need to surface. We're returning to something that existed, that always has existed and has been kept alive by politicians and race hustlers in this country. And it leads to tribalism. It leads to hatred, and we can't have that. And so one of the difficulties of talking about these issues is that they're so emotionally charged for people, like religion is, that people very quickly find themselves judging what others are. I mean, someone's going to listen to this, they'll judge everything we're saying. And they may very well be aligned with us, and so they don't judge very harshly, but like every politically affiliated thought is judged harshly by others, and then there's some emotion that's attached to that, and then there's justification that's built ideologically or in someone's mind for what can be done about the problem that exists. And in Marxist revolutionary intent, the aim is violent revolution, period. It always has been. If you study the 4 sections of the 1858 Communist Manifesto, 48, 58, 48 Communist Manifesto, you see it laid out plainly, and I try and summarize that for people in my book because I think it's worth understanding. It helps you make more sense of the world. Yeah.
Well, I am encouraged because it looks like on Twitter, more and more people are waking up to this. It's no longer fringe. So that is encouraging. We might be pleasantly surprised, or things might get very difficult in the near future.
Hopefully both. I mean, no, that's not what I meant to say. I assumed that things will get bad. When I say hopefully both, what I mean to say is hopefully we also are pleasantly surprised.
Yeah.
At political outcomes or whatnot, or the fact that people come around and wake up a bit.
Yeah. I want to read something. This is from a Pew Research report from February, and this completely ties into one of the reasons why I started this project, this podcast. So from the report, the share of Americans who say they have a great deal of confidence in the military to act in the public's best interest has fallen 14 points from 39% in November 2020 to 25% in the current survey. And on top of that, I mean, we've seen bad decision-making from past commanders-in-chief, our current commander-in-chief. I mean, President Obama's withdrawal from Iraq prematurely, I believe, that it led to the rise of ISIS. And so many countless sacrifices seem to have been undone. And the same thing occurred with Biden's withdrawal in Afghanistan, which ceded so much hard-earned territory back to the Taliban. You mentioned earlier that recruitment this year is historically low.
It's suffering, yeah.
It's suffering. So my question is, why would anyone trust the U.S. military? Why would anyone join the U.S. military at this point? Should they?
I think that the American people want to trust the United States military. If you lose your trust in the United States military and legitimately lose that trust, then you don't have a country anymore.
Yeah.
But the American people want to trust in the U.S. military, and the reason that they still can is because the majority of people that serve in that military are patriotic, America-loving citizens, regardless of their political views, who want to accomplish a mission for the defense of this country. And I really believe that. And so I talk about a lot of ugly things publicly about the military because we need to draw attention to those things. which has the unfortunate byproduct that, there's negative attention on our U.S. military. You can't solve the problem without drawing that negative attention to our senior leaders, but there's good people in the military that suffer because of a stigma that's now in our military. And it's not my fault that stigma exists. It's the fault of the senior leaders who make these policy decisions and push their political activism that then causes the negative attention. And then unfortunately, there's a kind of new stigma for our service members. But you can trust the American military in that it contains vast numbers of its service members love their country, and they're trying to do a mission to protect you. But what they can't do is break ranks, stop doing whatever mission they're doing, and show up at the southern border with a bunch of guns and keep you safe that way, because that's not their job is to follow orders.
Yeah.
And if people who have a particular job somewhere in the world or in some state at a particular operations center, let's say space-based missile warning, abandon their post to go keep your border safe, well, where's our military? They should be there at the border keeping us safe. They're part of the problem. It's like, you don't understand how the military works.
Yeah.
If they leave the missile warning station that they're manning to go man your border, then the whole country's vulnerable to missile attacks. And so are all of our allies around the globe. And so people say a lot of things that they don't understand what they're talking about, or they just, they speak loosely because they're emotional or they're upset about things. But that's the reason you can, that's the way in which you can trust your military. It's the good people that serve in uniform.
Yeah.
I wouldn't trust our senior military leaders. They're political appointees who are currently, unfortunately, whether they want to be or not, pawns in the hands of a Biden administration who I think has policies and strategy that are misprioritized or misaligned with our actual national security threats. And I think the Biden administration is a pawn for other people and organizations and interests in the global stage. And he can't necessarily help that either. I think he's probably maybe happy to play that role, but he can't help that. I mean, people won't like that I just said that. He can't help that. They'd say, well, if Trump could or whoever could, my guy could. Yeah, maybe not. I mean, the international system, the non-government organizations, the billionaire clubs in the world, they've become exceptionally powerful. Frankly, I'm personally convinced that Barack Obama and Michelle Obama have more influence in the White House than Joe Biden does right now.
Yeah.
And it wouldn't surprise me if she ended up running for office in 2024. But yeah, we've got some big problems to fix. And even if you were to put George Washington in the White House right now, I'm not sure he could fix them. And he's about as decent a guy as we had in the founding history. He's phenomenal. And it's not don't underestimate the power of your voice as a service member or as an American citizen, but don't think that some person is going to come and fix your problems regardless of their status or their office. I think that's all true.
Right. I've been watching some of the things playing out in Ukraine, and I saw how this was interesting. SpaceX was working with the Pentagon to provide the Ukrainians with Starlink terminals so that they could access the internet, patch up gaps in their coverage. And it just really seemed like an interesting private-public cooperation. But let's say somebody who is perhaps in high school or college, and they're passionate, they feel like they have a propensity or calling to join the defense or national security field. Would it be a better idea for them to join the private sector, like interesting organizations like SpaceX, rather than the US military, where despite all the great people you said are dedicated to national defense, there is still they still answer to the regime, the bureaucracy. I'm just wondering if there are other alternative paths to service than the military for people who have that calling.
Well, service to humanity, sure, and even defense of our territorial integrity, sure. I mean, there's organizations or agencies that do that job at our border, for example. And so there's
but specifically those like people who are a warrior.
Space, warrior. Well, the advice I've tried to give some people, parents reach out to me occasionally, and say, hey, my son Johnny is really upset. We are upset by what we're seeing in the news cycle over the past couple of years about what's become of our military. And we thought we'd reach out to you to ask for your advice, or are you willing to have a conversation with us and him to help us determine if, he's in a senior year of high school, he was planning to enlist, or he's planning to go to one of the service academies. Is it still the right answer, or should we avoid that altogether? That's, another way of asking the same question. And I've been giving the same advice because I've got strong opinions that I sometimes don't dare share about some of this, but like, for example, an impulse might be stay the hell away from the military, but that doesn't solve our problems. And so I back up and I think, no, that's not the right answer.
Sure.
A better answer is, because you can't give that advice. It's not even good advice. If people feel that it's important for them to serve their country, and I wish everyone felt that it was important to serve their country, maybe in uniform doing military service, then I'd like for them to go into that commitment, because it will be some temporary commitment, however long it might be, with their eyes wide open to the challenges that they will potentially experience while in uniform. And they have to go in understanding that as they make a commitment to serve, and maybe figure out ahead of time how it is they might choose to navigate some of those difficulties. And that's the best I can do at the moment, because there's people that love their country and think, heaven forbid, all the, this won't happen, because plenty of good people will always stay around in the military, even if terrible things are happening in our military. But, people use the phrase like, oh, you can't have all the good people leave. You can't have all the good people leave the police force. You can't have all the good people leave the military. Well, yeah, you certainly can't. In fact, I think it's impossible that all the good people would leave, but you can't have a lot of good people leaving. And so to encourage people who are dissatisfied with the politicization of our military from military service might in fact be a disservice to them, because maybe they ought to be in our military. And maybe there's some good that they can do there. I'm grateful I'm not in the military right now. I'm grateful I can speak up as a civilian, having served in uniform, and I don't want to be back there. There's a lot of hard things that they're dealing with, and I'm trying to figure out how to navigate the new world here and be a citizen, full-time citizen.
Well, maybe if somebody does decide to enter the military and they love the country, they're a patriot, maybe they can seek out more senior service members who can help them navigate some of the indoctrination, the Marxism.
I'll tell them, at every level of your military service, whether you're the newest airman in the Air Force, or a staff sergeant or a tech sergeant in the Air Force, you've been in a few years now, there is someone, roughly speaking, immediately superior to you in the ranks just above you, who you will find good mentorship in, good grounded, I guess there's this new jargon now, based worldview that is able, who may be politically aligned with you, although typically, again, that hasn't necessarily mattered, but who will, even if they're not, be a good sounding board for you, and who will help mentor you professionally in your military service. That still, I believe, exists at all levels of service. I'm going to make an exception. I wonder about the general officer ranks now. The more I learn about and hear stories from, and I spend a lot of time among the general officers. I think there's fine Americans in our general officer ranks, even now, but I wish more of them were courageous. And I wish more of them were willing to put their reputation on the line to take a stand for the idea of returning our military organizations to not being so politically charged. And maybe they are in their own internal kind of a way, and I'm grateful for it. But at every other level, you've got good people that are going to be good mentors to you, good examples for you, and they'll stand with you in principle. Good. And by the way, if you're going to think about joining SpaceX for work, then read a biography of Elon Musk first. There's one done by Ashley Vance called Elon Musk. Ashley's a man. And it's an excellent biography, but you get a sense for his tenacious mentality. He's a phenomenal thinker. He's a hard worker. And I think you got to be somewhat aligned with his work culture if you're going to thrive in that work environment.
Uh-huh.
And I wouldn't want to work with Elon Musk in SpaceX. I'd love to sit down and chat with him. And I think he's a fun, interesting guy, but I wouldn't want to work with him. I'd have to be totally dedicated to like getting to Mars and be willing to like stay up all night working with him, you know?
Yeah.
And that's not me. I want to divorce my work life from my private life.
It's a good plan. So I've been watching some of your podcast.
Yeah.
Every once in a while, you'll make a comment, and I don't know if it's not frustration, but it's more like reflection about how it's difficult to convey your thoughts, or how you wish you had clarified something. Is there anything you would like to clarify, or that you thought was misrepresented about your story, whether when you were at the Bradley Air Base or to date?
Buckley.
Buckley, yeah.
Buckley Air Force Base, now Space Force Base, actually.
Oh, okay.
It changed its name. Well, the Department of the Air Force changed its name. The short answer is no. I don't need to clarify anything. I guess that, thanks for asking, that expression of disappointment in my own inability to communicate things clearly is that sometimes when you're talking about any issue of importance, you know, you've got this picture before you that's yay big.
Yeah.
And you get these chopped up little segments of time to maybe capture something because you really genuinely hope to convey something meaningful or truthful about what you see to an audience who's half listening and then gets to hear snippets of a story. And then you always reflect back on it and you think, I mean, no, first off, no one wants to watch themselves on camera.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, like, you don't want
I'm
to watch
learning that.
yourself.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's like, geez, do I really look like that? And so, in fact, you know, I was just reading in the beginning of Exodus in the last couple of days about Moses and Aaron and some of these events of the Exodus, and it mentions in there that Moses is slow of speech.
Yeah.
And I've for most of my life I've thought like, oh, he's got some kind of a speech impediment, the poor guy, and so he needs to have the spokesman appointed for him who's actually going to be the powerful voice before the mighty Pharaoh and his court. And you know, I read it a little bit differently this time through as I looked through it, and I tried to look at some context. I'll admit there's plenty of people that would disagree with this, but I thought maybe for once I can better appreciate what it meant that he thought, hey, I'm not the adequate spokesperson that you think I need to be. I'm slow of speech because I give a damn about what I say, and I really want to make sure I get this right. And I'm not quick to just rattle things off, or I'm not. And I can't say that that's entirely the story that's showing up there in Moses, but I don't think it necessarily means that he somehow had a kind of handicap in his speech. And there might be that too. I genuinely think there's something there that was off-putting to this personality about showing up before others and like trying to be, you know, be a voice for such an important message. And there's some extra biblical texts that I've looked at as well that make me start to think that. But as I was like, only reason I bring that up is because, you know, that's the reason I express that frustration, is because sometimes things are really important and you want to convey the truth about them.
Yeah.
And you're a weak vessel. And so you do what you can, you start a show and you get a little more time. And I interviewed Randall Carlson today for my podcast. That'll be available next Thursday. And, you know, there's someone who's got he's got a really big brain.
Yeah.
And he's got all this picture that I'd like for him to be able to share. So I pick and choose some threads to pull on. And I as I'm interviewing him, I get an hour in and I think, my gosh, like, we're not going to cover anything because there's just too much to cover.
Yeah.
It's like trying to read the encyclopedia on the air or something, right? And so, and I'm not comparing myself to Randall Carlson in that regard, but just to make the point that there's a reason he started his own podcast hosted by two other guys. And he's now, I don't know, 80 something or 90 something episodes in perhaps, or maybe 100 something. And they're each an hour and a half, 2 hours, because he's trying to like unfold a volume of information for people that might be helpful for humanity.
Yeah.
And so there's some people that have done that, and we're the grateful recipients of their thinking, you know?
Exactly. Yeah. Well, I want to start wrapping up, and it's funny that you mentioned Randall Carlson because I kind of had like a what I thought would be a fun question.
Oh
So
yeah.
you begin your book with this sentence: to appreciate just how disproportionate, ugly, or evil a thing is, sometimes one must first comprehend what is balanced, beautiful, and good. I recently attended a weekend series of
Hmm.
lecture on geometry that drove home these ideas to me. Now, was that
That's funny.
what was it the sacred geometry class
It
that
was.
Randall? That's so
In
funny.
fact,
Yeah.
that was 1 year ago, because
Oh
that's when
yeah.
I published my book was a year ago, and it was 1 year ago in April. And yeah, that's what it was. It was a Randall Carlson course in Sedona, Arizona,
Okay. That's so cool.
and
I
it was
mean,
phenomenal. I mean,
I've seen Randall Carlson on Joe Rogan. He's mentioned your name to him before
he
too,
has, yeah.
but fascinating guy. And I would love to learn more about this geometry class. I actually hang on. So
Oh yeah. What have you got?
this is an architecture book by Steve Bass, and I would say that the first time I was made aware of this concept of sacred geometry was through an architecture book because
Oh yeah, yeah.
Steve Bass he walked me through the Pythagorean uh, theory, but also mythology of where we get the golden ratio, this considered the most beautiful segment, and from there, basically classical architecture derives from that, and it's somewhat esoteric and just fascinating stuff. And
Well, I spend a lot of my time in this realm,
oh
and
yeah,
um, one of the things I'm doing for my personal homework every night is working through Euclid's Elements. There's
yeah,
13 books in Euclid's Elements, and so I get out a compass and the giant sketch pad, and I start with uh, Proposition 1, and I just sketch it out and read it and make sure I understand it before I go to Proposition 2, and so on through Book 1. And I hope to
yeah,
better understand math again, mathematics as it was taught. Euclid lived 3rd century BC in Alexandria, but um, Iamblichus was a writer a couple of millennia ago who did a biography of Pythagoras.
mm,
And if you haven't seen Iamblichus's Life of Pythagoras, is what the book is called. I think it's an interesting read if you're interested in what it sounds like that Bass book is talking about,
yeah,
um, because you learn that you know the the Pythagorean theorem wasn't the only thing we got from, as you're alluding to, from a guy named Pythagoras, who we don't know much about. But
yeah,
in fact, he seems to have somehow fundamentally shaped the Greek culture
hmm,
and even potentially maybe philosophical or religious worldview. He's before Socrates and Plato and Aristotle. And so they reference him. He had an interesting school where philosophy and mathematics and things were taught or expounded. It was also somewhat what you might term mysticism or the esoteric tradition.
hmm,
Certainly, it was a part of that. And so we only get a glimpse, looking back now thousands of years, into what was really going on there. But Iamblichus, his biography of Pythagoras is one of the ones that will be referenced by modern writers who also want to write about Pythagoras. And so I'd recommend looking into that. And as far as sacred geometry goes, we can talk offline. Just geometry generally fascinates me, but specifically, you mentioned the golden ratio or the golden section,
yeah,
and it shows up all throughout nature. It shows up in the human body, which has the golden section actually all throughout it. I mean, from the tips of your fingers to your knuckles, to your wrists, to your elbows, from the head to the navel and to the feet, it's everywhere.
yeah,
And it's almost as if uh, in the human that we learn from Genesis was created in the image of God, male and female created he them. Um, that something about this divine template that exists all around us in nature is most perfect in the human
mm,
who was created in the image of God. Like, it doesn't show up in such beauty and perfection anywhere else in nature. It shows up in the nautilus shell. It even and people have tried to build grand architecture, especially in the medieval warm period
yeah,
and the 1300s, 1400s. You see some of these Gothic cathedrals show up throughout Western Europe, like Chartres Cathedral and others. There's beauty in the architecture there that seems to come out of nowhere, but no one can exactly kind of get to what we've got going on here in our own body. I mean, it is divine. And so I had someone leave a comment on Facebook the other day. Why? I don't understand your obsession with some of this stuff, like sacred geometry. I took a course in it once and I just don't get it.
Yeah.
But, all of this, as Randall said today on the podcast, you can hear it next week. Geologists focus on what's beneath them for answers to life's questions. The astronomers focus on what's above them for answers to the cosmos. And like, where's the tradition now that it should be a part of any seeker's path? You focus on trying to build an overarching worldview that tries to accept or assimilate into that worldview the truth about all of those things, and find some connection between all of these fields of inquiry, whether it's religious, philosophical, geological, astronomical. The ancients were serious about that stuff. We're not so serious about that in modern society. We've dissected and divided everything up into, biology has its own little tentacles that everyone spends their lifetime trying to perfect and understand, and they miss the bigger picture.
Yeah. They missed the bigger picture. Yeah. It's disintegrated.
It is.
Yeah.
Where's the integral worldview? Where's the integrated worldview, right? Well, it's our job to find it.
Well, it sounds like now you have more opportunity to kind of explore that. And are you going to be doing multiple series with Randall?
Yeah, we'll probably have a 2 or 3 or 4 part series. This first episode will be about an hour and a half.
Yeah.
And then I actually plan to have on after him Ben Davidson, who has a YouTube channel called Suspicious Observers.
Okay.
And he works closely with an alternative cosmological paradigm, the electric universe model. And I'd like to get his take on some of the ancient or recent, geologically speaking, historical cataclysms that we have in the rock record, and what ended the Younger Dryas period and the transition from the Pleistocene to the Holocene. And, Randall talks about cosmic impactors. We're going to get Ben Davidson in to talk about the sun and the sun involvement and solar involvement and some of its interactions with the earth. And then I'll take some time to do some more solo episodes. But I plan to my intent for this really is to try and, how is it that I can somehow help, based on what things I think I've come to appreciate that are true and lovely or beautiful, how can I share that with people, and they can take from it whatever they find may be useful in their own worldview. And so that's kind of my aim. We'll see if I like it after 6 months or if I'm tired of it.
Well, whatever happens, it sounds like you're on the right path. And
yeah, good.
and it sounds like you went through quite a trial to get here. So as we close, I actually want to just extend my admiration to how you handled that situation. First of all, exposing the wrongdoing that you witnessed, but also dealing with some of the office politics and eventually being fired from a job you were, I assume, passionate about.
Yeah.
And I mean, I understand it requires courage to join military service and to put your life on the line, but to confront your friends and to confront people who should have been literally your wingmen and be so betrayed and ostracized and fired for it. I mean, to handle it with dignity and composure, that takes a different kind of courage. So thank you for that. And I'm sure you've given a lot of people a model to follow.
I hope so.
Yeah.
Yeah. I was fired before it was cool. Now people are like willing to get fired over the COVID thing. And
yeah, you're a groundbreaker.
Yep.
All right. Well, thank you, Matt, for your time today. And folks watching from home, if you like this episode, give it a like and don't forget to subscribe, and we'll see you next time. Thank you, folks.